Right now, we maintain, as a nation, 700 to 800 military bases around the world. No other country does anything remotely like that. That is not just very expensive, but that is also a kind of running the world, if not by hitting people, by threatening to hit people, because we have troops and planes and bombs and missiles and all over, right? I mean, right in your neighborhood and not far from. What are we doing? We came out of a situation where we thought this would protect us. And in some ways it did. And even in some ways, I'll grant it does. But you have to ask the question, what else is it doing? And the answer is, it is defining the United States as the holder backer of what we are trying to do here in the Ivory Republic in Africa, or in Malaysia, or in Paraguay. It is the entity that's having a hold on the world, trying to hold us back. When the American naval fleet sits in the South China Sea, a stone's throw from Taiwan, nobody cares about Taiwan. Nobody is fooled by this. Maybe a few Americans who are naive. This is not about Taiwan. Taiwan is not a concern for China either. It's the symbolism of it all. And it allows the Chinese to say, look at them. They are here threatening us because we are out competing them. Neither you or I can resolve how honest or true that is. It's got some truth, it's got some exaggeration. But we are giving them the ammunition, if you like, with which to characterize us in this way. I'll give you another example. There's an enormous opposition inside Europe to the war with Russia in Ukraine. There are many, many Europeans, pro-capitalist, anti-capitalist, across the board, who think that is the worst mistake of their lifetimes, that struggle. They are clear in their mind, and I'm not arguing whether they're right or wrong. It's wrong, they should never have done it, it's stupid, the Russians will win, the Ukrainians will lose, end of story, it's a waste of money, and it is making the people of Europe furious because we're cutting back social programs while we fund a losing war that we don't care about in the first place. But that's a real problem. What are you going to do? You had 3 elections in the last few weeks. Britain, France, and Germany. Every one of those elections should tell you the same thing. The mass of people are rejecting the conventional politicians. You better be careful, because if they're doing that there, they're going to do it here too. Maybe Trump is halfway there already. Maybe what comes next will be more. Let me give you an example. For 15 years, you had the Conservatives. As the conditions of existence of the British working class declined over the last 20 years, and they declined worse than anywhere else in the Western world, the British, the Conservatives came up with the great idea, blame the Europeans. That's right up there with the United States today, blame the immigrants. Are you crazy? The United States is a country of 330 million. Undocumented immigrants in this country, maybe 10 to 15 million people. And among them, the poorest people on the planet. They are not going to shape the economy of 330 million. That's childish. That never happened, isn't happening now, and isn't about to happen. But if people are upset enough, and they are, and if they've suffered enough, and they have, then they are vulnerable to being told, okay, so the British did it. They left Europe with great fanfare 10 years ago, a little less, 2016. Brexit. Okay, they have Brexit. Their condition got worse, not better, which any fool could have told them. Why? Because that's not your problem. There are pros and cons about Europe. That's another. But the notion that by separating yourself from Europe, you're going to solve your problems? You got to be crazy. It's like if you stop the flow of immigrants across the border into Texas, you're going to make a friggin' bit of difference. It's just childish. But this is what smart people do when they're jammed. Now let's look at France. France has a middle-of-the-road leader, a nice young man, so he hasn't got age as a problem, Mr. Macron. Okay? In the National Assembly vote a month or 2 ago, 3 major parties contested. A left-wing party that's virtually fascist by Marine Le Pen, the National Front. His own party, the sitting president of the country, and a unity of 4 little leftist parties. The French Socialist Party, the French Communist Party, the French Green Party, and a French Socialist Party that takes the name France Unbowed. Those 4 came together. And you know what the French people did for their president? His party came in third out of three. The number one party was a party led by a former member of the French Communist Party, who is still a big leftist. That's the largest political bloc in the French Assembly right now. And then in Germany, you had an election. It wasn't national the way it was in Britain and France. It was in the eastern region. 2 or 3 Länder, they're called in Germany. They're like states in the United States, roughly. In those, the right-wing quasi-fascist party that has arisen in Germany, that's an achievement, man, because Germany is where they had Nazis and Hitler. So to be a right-wing, to salute with Hitler, to have a swastika on your shirt, it's something anywhere in the world, but to do it in Germany, amazing. They came in first. Who came in second? A relative political unknown. A woman, Sarah Wagenknecht, who is a Marxist, has been a Marxist all her life, was a fixture of the Marxist left in Germany, decided to run on her own, and comes in second. Okay, what we're seeing here is a rejection of the status quo on a massive scale. You got to deal with that, and none of them are. You know what Mr. Starmer, the new head of Britain, his first 2 acts as the new Labour Party Prime Minister? He's cutting fuel assistance to poor people in England as they face the coming winter where they are desperately in need. Why? Because fuel has gone up in price. Why? Because British can't get their hands on Russian oil and gas, which is the cheap way Britain has heated itself in wintertime. So they can see real clear the connection with Ukraine and Russia on the one hand and their own suffering. And you know what else Mr. Starmer said is, besides saving money on giving fuel aid to the poor, he's going to give more to Ukraine. Man, this is the end for him. This is the end for the Labour Party. They are creating a situation where the British working class is going to finally figure out that relying on the Conservatives and the Labour Party back and forth between these two is not solving their problem. And why am I telling you this? Because in the United States, we are in the midst of the process of our working class reaching the same conclusion about the Republicans and the Democrats. This is holding back. These conflicts play out. Britain is a basket case economically and becoming more so. They don't even address the problems they have. They are so caught up in not being willing to face their real problems and make the changes. The empire is gone. And no matter how pompous the inauguration of their new King Charles, it doesn't make it more than a piece of Hollywood theater. You know, the Chinese a year ago began to deliver around the world a statistical result, which the United Nations endorsed. It went like this. Over the last 10 years, we have raised 800 million people out of poverty in China. Their average income went from X to Y. Y is higher than X by enough to say they are no longer in poverty, they are in modest, or whatever the terms are that the UN uses. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's exaggerated or not. Probably is, but who knows? But it's the right thing to say. It gives them the word that the rest of the world, the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world, is most interested in. How can we do that? Let me give a statistic just to try to help people get a handle on it. I recently was invited to give a speech to an organization in Lagos, Nigeria. And in order to prepare for that speech and what they asked me to talk about, I went back to reacquaint myself with this example of Africa in relationship to the United States. And I did it because Nigeria is a very important country in Africa, one of the most important, maybe the most important in Africa. Here's a 1-minute summary. The population of Nigeria, which will amaze people, is 220 million people, okay? That's 2/3 of the United States in Nigeria. We, the United States now, is a country 50% larger than Nigeria. We have 50% more people, roughly. What is the GDP, the gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services achieved in Nigeria in one calendar year recently, 2022, 2023, whatever I could get? $500 billion, so about $500 billion. give or take. What is the GDP of the United States recent year? 22, 23 trillion. Okay, that means that while the United States is 50% more people, it has 50 times the wealth of Nigeria. Now, I don't think that's a sustainable arrangement for anybody. No matter what your economics are, or your politics, or the ideology, or anything, that's not sustainable. You cannot, especially in a world where those 220 million are in a position, which they are, to learn all about the difference. This is not going to work. And indeed, the proof of it was that the people who invited me to speak there believed that. And that's what they wanted me to talk about, because they find it intolerable. And they're upset, and they're bitter, and they're angry, or they're, a good number of Nigerians leave Nigeria. They don't want to, but the difference between the life they can lead in the United States or Europe or someplace else is just so enormous that for their husband or their wife or their kids, look, I understand all of that. My parents are refugees from Europe. They came to the United States to survive and to do better, which they did. But it's not sustainable. You got to do something. You cannot fob that off. But in fact, that's what's being done. Neither Europe nor the United States is addressing this question. Just doesn't do it. Give them verbalisms, give them noise, just noise. The Chinese are everywhere, building bridges, erecting schools. It's amazing to watch. We in the West, we are making it easier for this to blow up in our face. This self-defense of pretending this isn't going on is killing us. It's like watching a slow-motion train heading into a stone wall. You want to scream at the people on the train, stop the train, get off the train. You have the power, you can do it. Pull the brake, yell at the conductor, do something, but they're so busy partying that they don't recognize what's happening. I think there are very basic similarities between the United States and China, which I would be glad to tell you about. And those are more than enough that a comparable deal could be and should be worked out. Nuclear war is not an option unless you're lunatic. And I'm assuming that the prevailing mentality in Washington, in Beijing, and everywhere else is not lunatics. Americans don't understand what terrible war is. They just don't. They've never suffered being on the losing end of a major war fought on their own territory. The Chinese have, the Japanese have, the Russians have, the Europeans have, and I could go on, but we haven't. In World War II, bombs fell in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, and never again. No American city has ever gone through that. The only time I ever went to a bomb shelter was when I was a student in my public school here in the United States, and they taught us how to get under our desk in case there was a bomb, which none of us understood and thought was a funny game. And when Americans talk about war, there's a bravado that sounds like a bad cowboy movie in which, you see the shooting, and then when it's over, everybody gets up and goes and has a cup of coffee or a beer. It's not a real trauma that settles into the consciousness. So my view is, here's what's similar. The Chinese never broke, not yet, from the capitalist commitment to organized production in a particular way. And that way has a small group of people at the top. They'll make the basic decisions. They decide basically what's going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, where it's going to be produced, and what is done with the revenue. And the rest of the people are employees. And they have the monopoly of the power. Do they share some of it? Sure they do. Especially if they're smart, they understand. But that's where the power is, and that's where the wealth accumulates. Because they keep whatever the net revenue is, a disproportionate amount for the owners and the top executives and all the rest. The Chinese don't do all that different, but they do substitute state officials, so that is very different. But they, ironically, are going to have a harder time maintaining that system than we in the West, because we have the ideological rationalization of it all. We teach, as I have done all my life, in the university, that this capitalist arrangement is necessary, is efficient. This is like teaching a catechism in a Catholic school. if you know, or any other religion. I don't mean to pick out Roman Catholicism. I know that we're teaching an ideology that rationalizes that. The problem in China, they teach an ideology that doesn't. If you open up Marx's Capital, which they teach people to do, Marx is all about there's another way of doing things, ladies and gentlemen. And in this country, we call it a worker co-op. It's a horizontally organized enterprise. It's a community that decides democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue. That's what Marx was talking about. And that's going to be on the agenda one way or another, there and here. And then the real question becomes, how will these two systems engage and struggle with the challenge that's coming from below? And the irony, which I don't think is far-fetched, is that they have a lot to get together on. They're afraid of that. They're afraid here in one way, but they're afraid another way there. And that, plus the threat of nuclear war, is more than enough to be able to do together now what Britain and the United States did back in the 19th century.